Good evening and welcome to the 6th Annual Richard D. Heffner Open Mind Lecture. I'm Chuck Keaton, Academic Dean of the Honors Program for the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University. This lecture series honors Richard Heffner, a longtime professor at Rutgers and host of the Open Mind Show on public television. For those of you who knew Professor Heffner, I hope tonight's discussion will bring back fond memories. For those of you who did not know him, I hope it provides some insight into Professor Heffner's approach to engaging with complex topics. With support from the Heffner family, the Open Mind Lecture Series continues Professor Heffner's commitment to thoughtful discussions of how history, politics, culture, and media mold our society. Today, we're thrilled to have Adam Liptak from the New York Times discuss how those issues are at play in the current United States Supreme Court. Before we proceed, let me say a few words about our platform and program. Unfortunately, the pandemic has prevented us from gathering in person. Fortunately, though, the virtual platform allows people to join from across the country, and we're excited to see so many people with us today. We are particularly pleased to have many members of the Heffner family who normally cannot attend. After brief introductions, Mr. Liptak will speak, and then he's willing to take questions. When we get to that point, I will offer a few tips about submitting questions in this Zoom platform. Now, to say a few words about Professor Heffner's commitment to education and thoughtful discussion, I would like to introduce Steve Eisner. Mr. Eisner studied with Professor Heffner before graduating from Rutgers College with a degree in political science in 1974 and from the Rutgers Law School in Camden in 1977. He practices law in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Welcome, Mr. Eisner.
Dean Keaton, thank you very much. And I want to thank Elaine and Alexander and the Heffner family for giving me the privilege to speak about Professor Heffner. In 1974, when I first walked into Richard Heffner's Monday evening seminar, Communications and Human Values, I realized that I was in the presence of an exceptional teacher and a unique individual. That spring was an era of jeans and flannel shirts, but Professor Heffner's appearance was always immaculate. I remember that even the way he smoked a cigar was unique. He could flick the ash off without really moving his wrist, and I've never been able to duplicate that or to duplicate anything else about him. Needless to say, you can imagine the outcry today if a teacher, an instructor, lit a cigar in class. Professor Heffner made our classroom an extension of his home, and he did everything he could to make his students comfortable and to make us feel respected and valued. He treated us exactly as he treated his guests on the Open Mind, with the same courtesy and with the same probing questions. He conducted the seminar in the true Socratic manner, teaching us to think critically and to think before we spoke. I was not alone in feeling regret whenever our once-a-week seminar ended, and when that spring seminar finally came to an end. Professor Heffner was truly that special and that exceptional. During the spring of 1974, Professor Heffner became the first chairman of the Motion Picture Classification and Ratings Board. He began commuting between New York and Hollywood on an almost weekly basis, but always found the time for his students and for Rutgers. He found the time to write me not one, but two law school recommendations because the first one somehow never made it into my application file. And he wasn't too busy to speak to the late Edward Blaustein, then Rutgers president, to try to ensure my acceptance into Rutgers Law School. Professor Heffner became known as the man who gave an X to violence. He accepted the chairmanship of the ratings board because of his fear of the tyranny of the majority, his concern that if the motion picture industry did not police itself and provide some parental guidance, that it might be subject to censorship from an outside agency. Professor Heffner's formidable intellect was never used to intimidate his students. He had a Churchillian mastery of the English language. His persona and personal integrity were consistent in any venue, whether in the classroom, on the open mind, or during a casual conversation. He never stopped being a historian and a teacher. Professor Heffner was a true proponent of the marketplace of ideas and believed that in a free society with free speech that the truth would prevail. He was a tireless and passionate advocate for the truth, which was apparent to his students and I am certain to all of his guests on the Open Mind. As a Rutgers College student almost 50 years ago, I didn't appreciate the impact of luck on all of our lives and careers. I had the good luck and good fortune to be Professor Heffner's student. His concern for my career and my family continued as long as I knew him, and my daughter Diana was privileged to serve as his teaching assistant when she attended Rutgers. Richard Heffner remained a cherished mentor and teacher of mine until he passed away. He will never be forgotten by any of his students. As a great teacher does, Richard Heffner has affected eternity, his students, and this wonderful university. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for those words, Steve, and thank you, Chuck and Elaine and the entire Rutgers community. I'm Alexander Heffner, Richard Heffner's grandson and host of the Open Mind. I'm really thrilled and delighted to see so many attending virtually, whether you're a former student of Dick's or a friend of Rutgers or a current student. We are really honored to continue this legacy and to further the values of Dick Heffner and the Open Mind through this lecture series. And that's why I'm thrilled to welcome our lecturer today, Adam Liptak, Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times. Adam himself has had a storied career in journalism, in the law, as an advocate and as a lawyer for the Times, as a reporter covering the Supreme Court beat, and as a columnist now. You can read him nearly weekly in the New York Times. And we wanted him to convene these really critical issues in public policy because one of the foremost passions of the Open Mind as an institution and of Dick Heffner's was thinking about the future of the Supreme Court and the meaning of that institution jurisprudentially, ethically, morally, in every sense. And no one can shine a more perceptive light on those matters than our guest and lecturer today, Adam Liptak. Without further ado, I want to thank Adam for joining the program, and we all really look forward to hearing his insights on the future of the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And it's such a distinct privilege for me to be able to give this lecture in honor of Professor Heffner. And I can only hope that the topics we're going to talk about are exactly the kinds of things he would have been eager to explore. I'm going to try to pull up some slides, which have mysteriously disappeared. Forgive me. This will only take a sec, I hope. All right. So I want to explore with all of you today where we find ourselves with a newly conservative 6-3 majority Supreme Court, 3 of them appointees of President Trump, in what in some ways is a progressive era, where we have an active executive branch, where we have both houses of Congress controlled, if only slightly, by Democrats. And that does seem like a recipe for a clash. and it gives rise to lots of interesting questions. But let me take you back in 2 steps in an effort to explore where we find ourselves. The first step is in September, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies at the age of 87, having made the bet that she would be able to retire under a Democratic president, and she got close. But as it turned out, her repeated battles with cancer ended sadly before she was able to make good on that bet, raising the question inevitably about whether the people who had urged her to retire under President Obama might have had a point. But none of that should tarnish her legacy as the leading litigator on behalf of women's rights, someone as significant in the battle for women's rights as Justice Thurgood Marshall was in the battle for civil rights for Black Americans. And then a stellar run on the Supreme Court, where she was a superb justice. I had the pleasure of interviewing her on the record a couple times, of seeing her on the bench, always immaculately prepared and in command of the record and the law, and a deft writer, to be sure, very often in dissent. Through her time on the court's liberal wing never exceeded 4 members. And then let me take you back one more step to February of 2016, when Justice Scalia died, because this really sets up where we are in the current Supreme Court. With Justice Scalia's unexpected death in 2016, an election year, we had a court that was now split, the 8-member court, 4-4. 4 Democratic appointees, all liberals, 4 Republican appointees, all conservatives. And it looked like President Obama would have a chance. After all, he had something like a year left in his term, would have the chance to appoint someone to create a conservative majority on the court for the first time since the Warren Court, for the first time since the 1950s and 60s. And had President Obama been successful in appointing someone to the court, we would be living in a different world. We would be living in a world very likely where the Citizens United campaign finance decision would have been overturned, where the Heller decision establishing a personal right to bear arms under the Second Amendment would have been overturned, where abortion rights would have been supported and affirmed, where affirmative action would be safe, where the death penalty would have been cut back. So this was a fantastic opportunity for President Obama, and one that, at least for a glimmer of time, seemed likely. After all, he had many, many months left to go on his term. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, was on vacation in the Caribbean. I hesitate to picture him in swimming trunks when he got news of Justice Scalia's death, and he immediately made a decision. And there's an interesting reason why he worked so fast that my colleague Carl Hulse reported in his book on the confirmation battles. There was to be a Republican debate that night. And Mitch McConnell was afraid that one of the leading contenders for president at the time, Ted Cruz, would announce that what the Senate needed to do was refuse to hold hearings for anybody President Obama would nominate. And Mitch McConnell thought he has to get out ahead of this. Why? Because it was McConnell's assessment that if the idea comes from Ted Cruz, it will be dead on arrival, because he was so widely disliked among his colleagues. There's a joke that senators tell each other. Why do people take an instant dislike to Ted Cruz? Because it saves time. So Mitch McConnell within hours of Justice Scalia's death, announces a new rule, one that we hadn't heard of before, that in a presidential election year, nobody should get a hearing, and that the American people should decide who the next justice would be. Now, President Obama, and this is characteristic of him, characteristic of President Bill Clinton, characteristic of Democrats who maybe don't fight quite as hard on matters of judicial nominations, takes his time, waits the usual period, and nominates somebody who he thinks is like a beautiful compromise candidate. Judge Merrick Garland, moderate, older, he was 63 at the time, had previously been praised by Republican senators, saying words to the effect of, if you just send us Merrick Garland, that would be an easy lift. Not a radical, quite old by Supreme Court standards. And he nominates Merrick Garland, confident that this is a move toward compromise. It turns out that he was naive or too optimistic, and Republicans held to their theory that they were not going to give Judge Garland or anyone else a hearing, and the Obama presidency expired with the seat remaining vacant. This raises some questions. Would President Obama have been better off to nominate somebody who would energize his base? If he was going to lose on this anyway, might he have had some political advantage to nominate, say, a person of color or a woman or someone younger who, when Democrats would perceive this person was being mistreated, might actually go to the polls for that reason? So the idea would be not to win the seat because the seat was unwinnable, but at least gain some political advantage. We'll never know, but that election, of course, was very, very close. President Trump, on the other hand, played his hand beautifully. He made the Supreme Court a central issue in the 2016 campaign. He did something that was unheard of, never been done before, started releasing lists of the reliable conservatives he would nominate to the court. And on his side of the ledger, it was probably a significant political benefit to people who, wrongly it turns out, but at the time there was skepticism on the right about whether a President Trump would be a reliable conservative, but his lists of judges did give some substantial comfort to conservative voters. So all around, this turns out to be a good issue, excuse me, for Republicans and not so much for Democrats. So Trump comes in, nominates Justice Gorsuch, and that's the first of 3 nominees he puts on the court. Let's pause to think about that. In a single term, Donald Trump put 3 justices on the court. That's a lot. Over 8 years, not 4 years, of the Obama administration, President Obama put 2 justices on the court. Over 8 years, not 4 years, of the George W. Bush administration, President Bush put 2 nominees on the court. So President Trump, whose tenure was quite controversial, will, for a generation, 2 generations, continue to influence the nation through his nominations to the Supreme Court, which gives you the sense that this power presidents have is enormously consequential. And it raises the question that President Biden has tried to engage or tried to avoid by creating a commission to consider structural reforms to the Supreme Court. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along, but that's a reaction to the frustration, if not anger, on the left about what they view as a stolen seat from Judge Garland, who, as we all know, has since gotten another pretty good job. He's now our Attorney General. And then the rush from Justice Ginsburg's death in September to nominate Justice Barrett and confirm her in October in an election year, opening Republicans to the charge of hypocrisy. When in 2016, they said no confirmations in a presidential election year. In 2020, not only in an election year, but on the very eve of the election, they rushed through Justice Barrett's nomination. They respond to the charge of hypocrisy, saying, well, it's different because in the one case, the president was in a different party than controlled the Senate, and in the second case, of the same party. But that kind of purely political calculation is not good for the reputation of the Supreme Court, which is why Justice Ginsburg, before she died, and Justice Breyer just last week have opposed the idea that many progressives support of trying to increase the size of the Supreme Court, pejoratively put, to pack it, to overcome the current Republican appointee majority. Let's pause on the constitutional text for just a second. People ask me the question of, was it constitutional for Republicans to refuse to give Judge Garland a hearing? And the answer, in my view, is yes, it was. It might not have been pretty. It might have violated political norms. It might have violated some constitutional values. But as you look at the text, what it says is the president shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. That gives you the sense that the Senate can withhold its consent one by one. You know, it can withhold its consent retail. It can withhold its consent wholesale. I believe they were entitled to do it. It wasn't pretty. I don't know what Democrats, if the shoe was on the other foot, would have done. And then I want to pause for a second to give you something to smile about that reflects very well on Justice John Paul Stevens, who retired at the age of 90. He was sitting on the bench when a lawyer arguing to then Chief Justice Rehnquist misspoke, I guess, and said, Judge Rehnquist, blah, blah, blah. And Chief Justice Rehnquist said, I'm not Judge Rehnquist, I'm Chief Justice Rehnquist. And Justice Stevens pipes up and says, don't worry, counsel, the Constitution makes the same mistake, because you see, it says judges of the Supreme Court. Well, if court packing is not the answer, well, there's a weird disconnect here. Public support for court packing is quite low. The historical experience with FDR trying to pack the courts in the 30s didn't go well, at least in terms of achieving an increase in the size of the court. Historians debate about whether it did not, in fact, achieve its goal of having the court become much more receptive to upholding his New Deal programs. But if court packing is not the answer, what other answers might there be? Court packing can be achieved by statute. Congress is allowed to increase and decrease the size of the court and has done so. The court has had as few as 5 members, as many as 10 members. It's been stable at 9 since the Civil War, but it could be done. A much better response as a matter of policy to driving politics out of Supreme Court appointments might be what basically every developed nation in the world does, which is either impose term limits, which is what you have in all of these circled nations, or impose mandatory retirement ages, which is what you have in all these other nations. And that idea of not letting justices serve until they're 87, Justice Ginsburg, until they're 90, Justice Stevens, and not let them time their retirements to try to retire under presidents whose politics they like, thereby injecting politics not only at the front end. The Constitution by design makes Supreme Court nominations political. A politician, the president, does the nominating. politicians, the Senate, do the confirming. So you have politics on the front end, but because our justices get to choose when they retire, you have a significant elements of politics on the back end. What's the problem with this? The problem with it is that it almost surely requires a constitutional amendment, and that is very, very hard to achieve. So we have a fix that is easy to achieve, court packing, but would diminish the Supreme Court's authority and legitimacy by making it seem even more political than many people think it is already. That can be done, but query, as law professors say, whether it should be done. The much more attractive option of term limits or mandatory retirement ages maybe should be done, but very hard to be done because would require a constitutional amendment. So let's have a look at our current Supreme Court. Using the usual conventions, the Republican nominees are in red, the Democratic appointees in blue, and by that metric, it's a quite lopsided court. The justices are arrayed more or less in order of ideology. So the court's most liberal member, Justice Sotomayor, is on the left. Its most conservative member, Justice Thomas, is on the right. And the important thing in these ideological arrays is not so much the number of 6-3, although that matters. It's who's in the middle. And last term, albeit briefly, Chief Justice Roberts was not only the Chief Justice, but also the median justice, what people sometimes call the swing justice, the person in the ideological center of the court who cast the controlling vote in many of the closely divided cases. And that made the Chief Justice, albeit briefly, it turned out, extremely powerful. And we'll look at this and talk about this a little more, but it had not been since the 1930s since you had a Chief Justice who was both Chief and median justice. These days, and the information on Barrett is quite tentative, but it does look like Justice Brett Kavanaugh has that middle position. And you do see the occasional decision these days in which the 3-member liberal wing, in order to prevail, now has to pick up 2 votes. And they have, albeit in relatively minor cases, picked up the votes of Chief Justice Roberts and Judge Kavanaugh. So now if there's a soft middle to the court, it's those 2 justices. An interesting thing about the court, and this has been true since the beginning of the Republic, is that the sweet spot for how old you are when you're appointed has really hovered right around 50 years of age. That's the age at which people are thought to be mature enough to have a measure of life experience and wisdom, young enough so that they can serve for a pretty long time, and committed enough to their jurisprudential views that presidents hope, not always seeing their hope realized, but that presidents hope that justices won't drift ideologically. In the past, ideological drift, typically to the left, was not uncommon. So Republican justices like Harry Blackmun, David Souter, John Paul Stevens moved to the left over time. Very few counterexamples, but Justice Byron White might be an example of a Democratic appointee who drifted right. But these days, presidents have really got this figured out, and there's precious little ideological drift, with the exception perhaps on this court. It's not a huge amount, but you did see Chief Justice Roberts in by now a large approaching double handful of cases and big cases join the court's liberals to vote to uphold the key provision of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, of voting in the last couple of terms, once in favor of abortion rights, once in favor of the young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers, wants to keep a question about citizenship off the census. I don't think that begins to make him a liberal, but it does demonstrate a certain amount of drift, so that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, who were appointed both of them by President George W. Bush, essentially simultaneously, start out ideologically in exactly the same place, but drift apart over the years. And some people have the theory, and I subscribe to it, that that's partly a function of the fact that he's the Chief Justice, not an Associate Justice. He was, of course, initially nominated to replace Justice O'Connor and might well have become an Associate Justice. But Chief Justice Rehnquist died soon after President Bush nominated Judge Roberts. He moved the slot over to the Chief Justice position. And when he becomes Chief Justice, he understands himself to have special responsibilities to be the custodian of the Supreme Court's authority, legitimacy, and prestige. And for that reason, he speaks about this publicly. He gets in a tangle with President Bush about whether there are such things as Bush judges and Obama judges and Clinton judges and Trump judges. He not only talks the talk about judicial independence and following the law rather than politics, but the cases I just mentioned seem to demonstrate that he also walks the walk. The Supreme Court is in some ways quite homogeneous. And to talk about this, I want to read a passage from Justice Scalia's dissent in the same-sex marriage case in 2015, in which he makes the point that by his lights, the court is much too homogeneous to take over on behalf of the nation, deciding questions as significant as is there a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. Here's what he writes. Take, for example, this court, and this won't map on fully to what you're seeing because there have been some changes in personnel since then, but it more or less will. Take, for example, this court, which consists of only 9 men and women, all of them successful lawyers. In another decision, he used the nice phrase that I like to, he called successful lawyers tall building lawyers, who all studied at Harvard or Yale Law School. That was true when he wrote. Justice Ginsburg gets an asterisk because she started at Harvard Law School, finished at Columbia Law School. And now on the current court, we have what is almost a revolutionary change of Justice Barrett having come from Notre Dame's law school. But still, considering how many law schools we have in the land, the fact that only 3 of them are represented and 2 of them are represented by 4 justices each is a curiosity. Justice Scalia continues, 4 of the 9 are natives of New York City. And that was true at the time. Scalia was from Queens, Ginsburg was from Brooklyn, Kagan was from Manhattan, and Sotomayor was from the Bronx. So not long ago, we had 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City represented on the court. Staten Island has somehow not managed to get a justice on the court, but maybe it will. But again, that shows you a kind of homogeneity. He goes on, 8 of them grew up in East and West Coast states. Only 1 hails from the vast expanse in between. He was referring to the Chief Justice from Indiana. Justice Gorsuch now qualifies too from Colorado. Not a single Southwesterner, or even, to tell the truth, a genuine Westerner, because California does not count. Not a single evangelical Christian, a group that comprises about 1/4 of Americans, or even a Protestant of any denomination. So Justice Scalia is quite right that the court, and this is in distinction to many earlier courts, is homogeneous and highly credentialed. Lately, and for the first time, a majority of the justices had themselves been Supreme Court law clerks. You can see for whom they clerked on the slide. And that also gives you a sense that you not only have to be highly credentialed, but there's a kind of aristocracy, an inherited sense of the position that you have to achieve this incredible golden ticket credential in American law. There's probably no more highly coveted credential than to be a Supreme Court clerk. And they pass it along to the next generation. Justice Scalia was saying, and it's true, and it's kind of astounding, given that for the great majority of the length of the Supreme Court, it was only made up of white Protestant men, that we have no Protestants on the court, and we have, depending on how you count it, 6 or maybe 7 Catholics on the court. Justice Gorsuch was raised Catholic, and in Colorado, at least, he attended his wife's church, an Episcopal church, and 2 Jewish justices, no Protestants. This probably represents a kind of progress. It wasn't too long ago. There was a Jewish seat on the court and a Catholic seat on the court, and now religion has receded. But you can also ask the question of why are Catholics so overrepresented? And I think this is just a hypothesis, and it may be quite wrong, but I think it may serve in some cases as a proxy for presidents who don't want to ask directly about how their nominees would vote in cases on abortion and whether to overrule Roe v. Wade. And those presidents might think, rightly or wrongly, that putting a Catholic on the court would give you some sense of where the justices are on those issues. The confirmation of justices has really changed quite radically. We don't need to look back in time very far to see how an avowed liberal, Justice Ginsburg, as I said, a great proponent of women's rights and litigating those cases as a lawyer at the ACLU, was confirmed by a vote of 96-3. Justice Scalia, well known to be a leading conservative, confirmed by a vote of 98-0. Now you fast forward to more recent years, and you see Justice Kagan 63-37, Justice Alito 58-42. So you have replicated on the court in the confirmation battles and on the court itself the polarization that plagues our nation and our political system is in some ways replicated on the Supreme Court. Now, I had mentioned before that in the last term, the term that ended in July, Chief Justice Roberts had taken on an incredibly central role. And these charts show you how much that happened. He was in the majority in all but 2 cases and really controlled his court. And had Justice Ginsburg lived, it would be a very different story. It would still be a 5-4 conservative court. But what he has now is a court where he's outflanked on the right by 5 justices. And that gives him much less ability to control his court, particularly when you step back and ask the question, not just how do the justices vote on the merits of cases, but which takes 5 votes, but in the question of which cases to add to the docket. The court gets to choose which cases it's going to hear. It votes on petitions seeking review, so-called petitions for certiorari, and only takes 4 votes to put something on the court's docket, meaning the 5 justices to the Chief Justice's right, it only takes 4 votes to put something on the court's agenda. And that gives Chief Justice Roberts it puts him in the spotlight. And in cases on guns and abortion, where his natural inclination is going to be his natural inclination is going to be twofold. One, he'd rather not hear the case. But two, if he is forced to hear the case, there's no particular reason he wouldn't vote as he generally does, which is in a conservative direction. This chart, slightly outdated, puts the justices in an array. Before we saw them evenly spaced, this gives you a sense of where they were if you have them in an ideological array, and it shows you how far off on the sides you have Justices Sotomayor and Thomas. I had mentioned earlier that the chief had been drifting left, true to a small extent of Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. And it's important to say that there is an element of politics in Supreme Court judging, but there's a significant element of law too. And you don't need to look any further than the court's refusal to engage, and unanimously, in the challenges that the Republican Party and President Trump brought to the 2020 election. This is my last slide. This is a pre-pandemic moment, which everyone used to enjoy. We called it the running of the interns, where TV reporters would set up in front of the court on big decision days, and they would be, the interns would be handed hard copies of the decisions and run them out to the justices. Now, in the pandemic era, I haven't been at the court since March a year ago. The court has been hearing arguments by telephone, which is quite unsatisfactory, and maybe we'll have some questions on that. But I think I'll close with just giving and turn to questions, because I'm eager to hear what's on your minds. I'll close with just the briefest of descriptions of 2 or 3 cases that might warrant, if we were not in the pandemic era, the running of the interns this year. The biggest case is probably yet another challenge to the Affordable Care Act. It's a case that strikes me as too clever by half. A few years ago, the Republican Congress, not able to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, zeroed out the tax penalty for not getting insurance. The individual mandate, perhaps you remember, was thought to be a crucial part of the law. And it said you either have to get insurance or pay a tax penalty. That in 2012, that provision was attacked. Chief Justice Roberts said, no, Congress has the power to have such a condition, to have an individual mandate, because Congress has the power to levy taxes. The argument now is that since the tax penalty is 0, the individual mandate is no longer constitutional. And the answer to that question is, okay, so what, who cares? But the argument goes on, brought by state attorney generals in red states, that means the entire law has to fall, that the mandate is so crucial to the law that it can't be severed from the rest of the law. And judging by the questioning at the argument in November, I don't think the court is going to buy that. And I think the Affordable Care Act will survive what is now the 3rd major challenge. A second case involves the court's recent great interest in religious liberty. The court has ruled in favor of religion in countless cases. And after the death of Justice Ginsburg, in the one area where religion had been losing, it switched course when Justice Barrett joined the court, and it started to strike down state restrictions meant to combat the pandemic on houses of worship and prayer services in homes, and has been saying that the right to free exercise trumps those state laws. The case before the court asked the following question: can the city of Philadelphia, which runs a foster care system and contracts with private groups, insist that those private groups not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation in screening potential foster parents. A Catholic charity says, we want to participate in the program. We have an active foster care practice, but we don't want to endorse same-sex marriage. Can the Catholic charities tell Philadelphia, we want to rewrite the contract. We want to say that we can discriminate based on sexual orientation. And that again is a clash between gay rights on the one hand, religious liberty on the other hand. And if the earlier cases tell you anything about this court, they tell you that religion is likely to win. There's so much more that I could say, but I won't say, except I'll say it in response to your questions. Thank you very much for this high privilege to be able to give the Heffner Lecture this year.
So thank you. Let me applaud on behalf of our crowd. Obviously, that's the one of the big disappointments of the Zoom era. Of course, we can't hear the roaring applause, but thank you so much.
I'm imagining it.
Absolutely. So let me invite questions now. For those of you attending, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. You can hit that to open the Q&A box. You can type your questions there. They'll go into a queue. They won't show up immediately until we actually answer them. We've got probably take 30 or so minutes to answer some questions. We'll see if we can answer as many as we can. We may or may not get through all of them. We do have a couple in the queue already. So Deb Miller asked, you addressed this a little bit already, but maybe want to expand. You said, she said, besides the idea of restructuring the Supreme Court, is there another option for nominations that would be more fair than giving the president this sole right?
Right. So the idea of, well, to give the president the sole right, the Constitution gives him the sole right to nominate, and that might not be the best policy. Lots of states and foreign countries use judicial commissions to try to identify promising candidates, but to change that would require a constitutional amendment, which really is a non-starter. But one thing that would at least withdraw an element of politics from the process would be at least to make the nominations regular. If you had fixed 18-year terms, every presidential term would have 2 nominees, and that might lessen the influence of politics in the process. There are legal scholars who think that can be done without a constitutional amendment. I tend to think they're wrong, but that might, whatever the answer to can it be done, it would seem to be sensible policy, if only because basically every other developed nation around the world does it, and we're the outlier.
Mm-hmm. And on a related note, perhaps, Michael Guggenheim asked, given what seems like inevitable disappointments liberals/Democrats will have with this 6-3 court, assuming Kavanaugh doesn't strategically drift left like Roberts did, are we coming to a political head when Democrats who are normally loath for big structural political reforms are forced to act? Think people like Senators Coons, King, Hickenlooper, and Manchin.
Yeah, if Democrats were more energized and had a more substantial majority, and if this seemed to be an issue that engaged President Biden, maybe there would be some hope. I mean, for starters, increasing the size of the court would either need to overcome a filibuster or do away with the filibuster for that reason. And since the more conservative Democrats don't seem to have appetite for either expanding the court or doing away with the filibuster, this is, a largely academic exercise. And the commission that President Biden has appointed, with 36, count them, 36, mostly prominent legal academics, superstars, but in creating such an unwieldy commission and asking them not for recommendations, but only for an analysis, you sure get the feeling that he is slow walking the problem. Whenever someone says, I'll appoint a blue ribbon commission, that doesn't tend to indicate that they are eager to really engage with the issue. So we'll hear in October from the 36-member commission an analysis of various things that could be done. One thing we haven't talked about that could be done is Congress has substantial control over the court's jurisdiction. The court currently gets to decide what it's going to decide. It has a discretionary docket. Very few cases are mandatory appeals that it has to hear. One thing Congress could do is just make the court work a little harder. It is now deciding 55 cases a year, the lowest number. Now, to be sure, the pandemic has influenced this, but the lowest number since the Civil War. One idea would be if you just made them a little busier, maybe they'd have less time for the big controversial cases.
I note that you used the word academic in there. You said many of these questions are academic. We are a bunch of academics in the crowd here, so we know all about that. Actually,
I meant it as the highest form of praise.
A little bit, shifting gears a little bit, Dean Roberts asked, will there ever be the appointment to the court of a nominee who has executive branch experience, or will we have law school professors from now on?
Well, so that's a point. To an extent, some of the current justices have executive branch experience. Both Roberts and Kagan worked in the White House, and a number of justices worked in the Justice Department. But I think the question is excellent in a broader sense too. It wasn't that long ago that we had justices who had large public careers. You had Earl Warren, who'd been governor of California, Robert Jackson, who'd been attorney general, Hugo Black, who'd been a United States senator. So the court that decided Brown against Board of Education brought a lot more to the job than purely formal legal skill, but a sense of how the real world operates. Justice Breyer is an example of this in a small sense, but you see it in his work. He'd been chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he understands in a way some of the other justices seem not to, about how legislation actually becomes enacted and what parts of the legislative paper trail are valuable to look at or not. So there's really no question that the court would be better off with someone like Sandra Day O'Connor, who had been a judge in state court in Arizona, but also had served in the state legislature, had also served in the state legislative branch, and that wealth of experience informed her jurisprudence in a way that a lot of people thought was sensitive to the real world.
Thank you. Switching gears to the process, Steve Murphy asked, how much do the justices communicate with one another as they ponder decisions?
The justices deliberate in the sense that most people would think of deliberation, very little. They don't discuss the cases until they take the bench, or these days take the telephone. And that argument is their first and in some ways most significant deliberation. So people misunderstand what the point of Supreme Court oral argument is. You might think, and Inform it does this, you might think that the justices are trying to elicit information from lawyers. In fact, they're talking to each other, and they're talking to each other for the first time, so that John Roberts, who was, before he became Chief Justice, a very accomplished Supreme Court advocate, said the job of the Supreme Court advocate is to sort of be a basketball backboard, where people are bouncing questions off the lawyer in an effort to talk to each other. Now, a few days after that argument, they sit down at private conference, only the 9 of them in a room, and in order of seniority, with the Chief Justice going first, say how they see the case and how they're going to vote, and go around the table one at a time. Nobody talks twice until everybody has talked once. And that means the junior justices in that conference may not have a chance to try to persuade the senior justices, because by the time it gets to you, there may be 5 votes against your position already, which is a reason why the oral argument is particularly important for the junior justices to get their points out. You also see the justices at argument Sometimes in minor cases, just trying to puzzle out the correct legal answer, or in other cases, knowing where they want to end up on the bottom line, but trying to jostle each other about what the right rationale is. Now, the most important deliberation actually takes place after conference, where people have tentatively, but I'd stress tentatively, voted. And the Chief Justice, if he's in the majority, assigns the majority opinion to whoever he thinks is appropriate, or if he's not in the majority, the senior justice in the majority assigns the majority opinion. And then the real deliberation happens on paper, because drafts start to circulate, draft majority opinions, draft dissents, and justices on seeing those draft opinions will either say, and in this odd locution, please join me, meaning you have my vote, or I'd like to join the opinion, but I have a problem with the paragraph 2 on page 16 because I can't buy that. And that might get altered or not. You're more likely to get the alteration if there are not 5 votes yet. And similarly, somebody might circulate a dissent that is so persuasive that it actually picks up votes. And once or twice a term, what had started out as a dissent may turn into a majority opinion. So the real deliberation at the court takes place on paper.
If I may inject a follow-up question
Yeah.
of my own. So you described the process for that initial conference, which
Yes.
the structural process puts the junior justices at a disadvantage. Is there any such structure in place for the questioning, or is that much more free form?
That's a very good question, and I'll give you 2 answers. When they're on the bench, it's a free-for-all. And to my mind, a very productive free-for-all, because one justice will ask a question and the second justice will respond to it in the form of a question, and sort of in the sense that a Jeopardy question is in the form of a question. They'll build on, respond to, and interact with each other. And it will be a dynamic and synthetic process. And from the point of view of a journalist, it's quite illuminating about what's actually on the justices' minds and quite illuminating about what they're likely to do. The phone arguments, which had been in place since the end of the last term and through the entirety of this term, are much different and much worse. The justices, for about 3 minutes each, ask questions in order of seniority. They'll ask questions whether they have a good question or not. On the bench, they will almost always ask only hostile questions, ask questions only of the side with which they disagree, which makes it quite easy for the likes of me to tell who's winning. Here, everybody speaks. Sometimes they ask the same questions the person before them had asked because that's all they got. They very seldom will not participate. A good part of the new system, one of the only good parts, is that Justice Thomas, who ordinarily doesn't ask questions on the bench, is a full participant in the phone arguments and asks excellent questions. But this system, which may be the best they could come up with to accommodate the pandemic, it strikes me as a menace, much worse than on the bench. Another upside, though, is people can listen in real time, whereas Supreme Court arguments ordinarily require you to stand in line, sometimes literally for days for a big argument, if you're just a member of the public, to get to have live access to the argument. Now with the phone arguments, anybody who wants to can listen. So there are pluses and minuses, but to my mind, the minuses outweigh the pluses.
Thank you. And Peter returns to the concept of the judicial drift that you mentioned. He asked, with Kavanaugh and Roberts drifting left, how quote unquote conservative do you see this court?
It depends on the issue, but on most big issues, I think the court will not be sympathetic to challenges to, say, the death penalty, will cut back on abortion rights, will cut back on affirmative action, will expand gun rights. So on the big controversial front page story cases, it's going to be the rare case. On the really salient cases, it's going to be the rare case where we have surprises, as we did in the cases I listed, because I don't know what's the big case where the liberals are going to pick up both Justices Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice. But I'll backtrack for a second and footnote that in the last term, there was a quite consequential case about whether gay and transgender workers are covered by a landmark federal civil rights employment law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex. And Justice Gorsuch, writing for the majority, joined by the Chief Justice, says that yes, that statute does cover gay and transgender workers as a matter of the actual text of the law. So one shouldn't make categorical statements. Who knows? And it's hard to tell yet because the number of votes that Justice Barrett has cast are too small yet to say anything convincing, although her record on the Federal Appeals Court and the way she has changed the court's position on the COVID religion changes makes you think that she is as conservative as the president who nominated her and the Senate, which confirmed her, hope she will be.
Thank you. Another important issue on people's minds, Gary Rifkin asked, how do you think the court will look at the question of voting rights?
The court, and this has been true for some time, doesn't like to interfere in state restrictions on voting rights. It effectively struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County against Holder. It said that federal courts have no role to play in addressing even extreme partisan gerrymandering. So I would not put a lot of hope in this court reacting to the voting restrictions that now that some red states are busy enacting. There is a case pending this term before the court on a different part of the Voting Rights Act. The part of the Voting Rights Act the court effectively struck down required states with a history of discrimination against Black voters to get federal permission before they changed voting rules. The court left intact a different part of the Voting Rights Act that allows after the fact litigation. And they have one of those after the fact litigations challenging two Arizona voting restrictions. One of them throws out ballots cast in the wrong precinct, and the other outlaws ballot collection, pejoratively called ballot harvesting. And I think the court is going to say those restrictions are fine. More importantly, we're going to see how much teeth this remaining section of the Voting Rights Act that Section 2 has. But I don't think voting rights advocates have a friend in the current court.
Thank you. And Garrett Broad asked a question that maybe gets to your role. How would you characterize the relationship between the current Supreme Court and the media? For instance, are they cognizant of media narratives? Do they attempt to shape public opinion via media? How has this changed over time?
That's a large and complicated question. I do have reason to think that not a few of the justices read the coverage closely. I don't think they care so much about coverage of given cases, but they do very much take offense at the notion, and this is true across the ideological spectrum, that they are engaged in a political act. They, all of them, believe, and sincerely, and I don't doubt that they say this in good faith, that they are applying legal principles and jurisprudential principles and not political ones. In some ways, though, that may be just a matter of nomenclature, because if you end up in the same place, I'm not sure how much it matters. But in a speech Justice Breyer gave at Harvard just the other day, he really doesn't like it when people like me call part of the court the liberal wing, or say that so-and-so was a Republican appointee or a Democratic appointee. Now, partly this is a good faith understanding of how they think they're doing their jobs, but part of it is also strategic. All of the justices know that the Supreme Court's authority is based on the idea that it's apolitical, and all of them have an interest in saying that, even if their private views might be different.
Thank you. Gary Barch asked, given the conservative strategy of making abortion far more difficult via the state legislature route, do you see any potential case on the horizon where there may be an actual case that would possibly result in the court's overturning of Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I would have said that the court is much more apt to restrict or hollow out the constitutional right to abortion. And I guess I still think that, but I don't think it nearly as strongly as I used to. The court has been sitting on now for 16 or 17 weeks a case from Mississippi that presents a direct challenge to the abortion right in Roe that would restrict abortions to 15 weeks. And the fact that they keep relisting it for their one private conference after another makes you think that they're thinking quite seriously about that. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati just today upheld a restriction that might be said to be a direct challenge to Roe. It said that a state, and I'm now forgetting which one, was free to prohibit doctors performing abortions solely for the reason of not wanting to have a Down syndrome baby. And Roe is generally understood to give women the right to have an abortion for any reason at all, so long as they do it early enough. And that law seems to be in tension with Roe. So that could be another route by which the court actually goes directly to the question of, is there a constitutional right to abortion?
Asking about a specific case, Ali said, you said that religion will, you said you think religion will win in Fulton versus Philadelphia. Do you think there's a possibility of appealing to Barrett's role as a parent of adopted children?
You know, it's very hard to tell how much personal experience plays a role in shaping justice's jurisprudence. And I'm sure if you asked her, she would say she would put personal, religious, and political views aside and just decide on the merits. But perhaps it will. But even if it does, it's not entirely clear what direction it would go in, because the Catholic Charities would say, first of all, no same-sex couples have come to us. If they came to us, we'd send them to another adoption agency. No same-sex couple, they would say, would be disadvantaged by giving us the religious right to be able to opt out of working with same-sex couples. So I feel reasonably confident in thinking that Justice Barrett and all of the more conservative justices will find in favor of the Catholic charity.
So turning to a hypothetical, but an important one, if Gene Winograd asked, from Arizona asked, I can't help wondering what would have happened if the insurrectionists on January 6th had murdered Pence and Pelosi. Would the Supreme Court have had any continuing power if Trump had declared himself president at that point? Trump is still declaring that he won. I fear it's naive for the legal system to think that another January 6th can't occur. Your thoughts?
So I'm happy to say that I'm happy not to have to contemplate that outcome. I mean, I do think we came pretty close on January 6th to a very different outcome. And, you know, were an autocracy to be imposed, if the experience of other nations is any evidence, an independent judiciary is not high on the autocrat's wish list.
So Dean Roberts asked, if a seat were to open this presidential term, who would or should would Biden name? And I think the question then continues, should it be Obama?
Maybe it should be Obama. And most politicians don't have the kind of retiring temperament you need to be a Supreme Court justice. And I believe I've seen Obama asked about this and dismissed out of hand. Now, Biden has said and essentially promised that he's going to put a black woman on the court. So that would rule out Obama. I think the front runners would seem to be Leandra Kruger on the California Supreme Court, who went to Yale Law School, clerked for Justice Stevens, worked in the Solicitor General's office, is very polished, highly credentialed, and would fit in with some of the things we saw in the slides. Or perhaps Ketanji Brown Jackson, who currently sits on the DC District Court, the trial court, but has been nominated to the DC Circuit. Harvard Law School, clerked for Justice Breyer. Again, it checks the right boxes. And the fact that Biden pretty quickly is putting her on the DC Circuit, the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, widely thought to be the second most important court, gives you the sense that she might be a front runner too.
So we've reached the end of the questions in the queue. If there are any further questions from the audience, we have time for a few more. Alexander, I see Alexander has his hand up. So Alexander, do you want to come back on screen then?
I'll just ask a question by way of audio, if that's okay. I'm eager to hear your answer, Adam. Thank you too for a wonderful lecture. Justice Breyer made those remarks virtually about the politics of the institution and fearing the impact. But I just wonder if you think he and or others on the court recognize the politics of 3 appointees from a president who did not win the Electoral College. I mean, there's politics on the front end too. And when justices make comments like that, they don't seem to reflect that reality.
Well, Alexander, I know that you're a questioner, by profession, and it's a good question. It requires you to psychoanalyze the justices a little bit. But my own view is that once a new justice comes in, they're kind of adopted as part of the family. Being on the Supreme Court, people have said, is like an arranged marriage with no possibility of divorce. So when Kavanaugh came on, even after his quite controversial hearings, justices across the spectrum were eager to work with him, and they have to, and they respect him, and they respect Gorsuch, and they respect Barrett. And while everything you say has a lot of weight to it, the justices don't see an upside to the court to say or acknowledge the points you're making. And I think that for all the reasons we've talked about, but also this one, much as progressives would like for there to be aggressive action to increase the size of the court, to overcome what progressives see as a stolen seat and an illegitimate president, I think with both Ginsburg and Breyer speaking up against enlarging the size of the court, it's tough. There are many reasons why it's a tough uphill fight.
Thank you. We've had 2 more questions come into the queue, and so I think that will probably take us to the end. So James Hadley asked, could challenges to proposals for DC statehood reach the Supreme Court? Do you have any thoughts on how they may rule in that case?
I haven't thought about this, and I'm going to free associate for you with the caveat that everything I say may be wrong. But part of DC has already once, I think, been ceded to Virginia. So long, the Constitution does want DC to be a federal enclave. So you'd probably need, several city blocks to remain that. But whether, I don't think there's any constitutional obstacle to the balance of DC becoming a new state or being ceded, as some people want it to be, to Maryland. But unlike the rest of what I've said tonight, about which I'm probably right, I may well have every part of this backwards.
Thank you. And the final question from Michael Guggenheim. Given the changed nature of Supreme Court confirmations, only 51 votes now needed, do you think the way appellate courts behave is now being changed? The motivation now is no longer to be broadly acceptable and seem middle of the road, thanks to Sotomayor and Roberts before their elevation, but to seem a loyal partisan soldier and therefore secure those 51 votes. What do you think?
Extremely smart question. That's a real insight. So when we had a 60 vote requirement, presidents wanted to present to the Senate someone who seemed to be reasonably moderate and middle of the road, so that when appeals court judges were in the political science lingo auditioning for the court, they would try to show that they were moderate. And so Justice Sotomayor on the Second Circuit, the Federal Appeals Court in New York, had a very moderate record on criminal justice, was fairly tough on criminal defendants. On the Supreme Court, entirely different. In this new era, we see appeals court judges auditioning in a different way. And on the right in particular, they seem to be auditioning to the Federalist Society, the conservative legal group, and writing 100-page concurrences on the administrative state or long dissents on gun rights, because now you're trying, as the question, very good question, as the question suggests, now you're auditioning not to the whole Senate, but to the part of the Senate and the part of the conservative legal community that's in control. And that's another artifact of polarization, and it's a pity. So are we going to end on that down note? I suppose we are.
Yeah, I suppose so. I guess I'll flip it around and just say, thank you for your time and your insights tonight. Thank you for engaging with our questions, even if some of them were downers like that. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening. Thanks for participating, for asking such wonderful questions that have really led to this kind of conversation, this kind of discussion, this kind of really digging into the topic that Dick Heffner very much would have appreciated. So once again, thank you, Adam, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to take just a moment and thank many people from the School of Arts and Sciences who worked behind the scenes to organize this event. Ian DeFalco, Kara Donaldson, Allison Klein, Christina Poggi, Lori Reba, Dana Ritchie, Sherry Summers, Christina Waite. I hope I didn't miss anybody. And last but not least, I would like to offer special thanks to the Heffner family for their support of the Open Mind Lecture Series. If you'd like to help support more of these thoughtful discussions, I encourage you to consider making a gift to the Richard D. Heffner Open Mind Lecture Operating Fund so that it may continue bringing high quality speakers like Adam Liptak. We will follow up with information about how to do that. Thanks again to everyone who made this event possible, from our speaker to our attendees and who asked great questions, to everyone behind the scenes. Thanks again for joining us, and good evening.